It's bourbonblog.com live. I'm here with my good friend Colin Spoelman, founder and distiller at Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, New York. And as many of you may know, this is one of my favorite distilleries in the world. The people, what they do. And I think the question that I tweeted a little bit earlier is, what makes Brooklyn bourbon so good, Colin?
Well, I don't want to be lumped into a category called Brooklyn bourbon. I think most people are sort of like, New York City. What could they possibly know about bourbon? But I grew up in Kentucky, so if people don't know the brand and don't know me, I feel like that's an important thing to sort of lay out in advance. That I grew up sort of in kind of the moonshine part of Kentucky, but that's how I first got interested in distilling, really, not necessarily bourbon as a product, but really the art of making unaged whiskey. And then as time went on, for us, that's led to a lot of different kinds of aged whiskeys. And so Kings County Distillery, if I were to tell you what it is today, which we've been around for about 10 years now, we exist at the intersection of a lot of distilling cultures. So we borrow a little bit from Scotch, a little bit from bourbon, a little bit from rye, Northeastern rye history, and a little bit from moonshine. So kind of pick and choose a little bit different kind of techniques and processes and end up with whiskey that's very unusual, but also very singular. There's nothing quite out there, I think, that's doing what we want to do.
Absolutely. There's nothing with this flavor. It honors the time-honored traditions of bourbon and a lot of those characteristics, but with the skill, the creativity that you all put on it, and just with the grain, with the talent, everything into one, it has this flavor that I've never really had on any other whiskeys. We're going to try several of these, but if those of you that have maybe you've seen the bottles, you've heard about the brand, the packaging, very minimalistic, and I love that you've never changed that. It's something so different that speaks of older times, right?
Right. Well, it was, we started very small. We were in a little one-room, 300 square foot studio, and I think we didn't want to pretend to be more of a business than we were. Now we're a little bit larger than when we got started. But I think the simplicity of it was something that people weren't really going for in the bourbon packaging world. And so it seemed like an opportunity to just do something kind of totally different than what everybody else was going for, which tended to be this kind of exuberant, sort of Baroque, old-fashioned, very, a lot of typefaces, fonts all over the place.
Right.
And so just to do something that kind of set aside graphic design and didn't really play that game too much, but also knowing really that we were going to be coming out with a lot of different whiskeys. And
right.
So the idea was to kind of create a pattern from which we could then, this is our Scotch style whiskey, this is our Irish style whiskey, this is our moonshine, this is our bourbon whiskey, rye whiskey, just kind of playing within that, kind of doing a lot of different types of whiskeys with our own sort of technique and spin and kind of creativity on it.
I like it. So we're going to try first. It's an annual release. It's the Empire Rye, a straight rye whiskey. That's what I have in my glass here to start with. This is really a category all of its own that was developed by several great distillers. I know you're among a handful of distillers that do this every year. Tell us about first of all, what is Empire Rye and what is your Empire Rye?
So Empire Rye is it's just rye whiskey made in New York is really the simplest way to put it. There's not a lot that differentiates it from any other rye other than history and tradition, which have played out in such a way that all of the original rye distillers, if you talk about Overholt, Michter's, all those great sort of Pennsylvania Monongahela rye whiskey brands, a lot of those got acquired in the 60s and 70s by Kentucky distillers. So most of the rye whiskey, nearly all the commercial rye whiskey, what I would say, is made in Kentucky by the big distillers. But it's fallen upon the craft distillers to kind of resuscitate that sort of older style, smaller stills, higher rye content rye whiskeys. And so this was an idea that was sort of hatched by a group of New York distillers. And for our part, it was Nicole Austin, who is the head distiller at George Dickel now in Tennessee. But it was kind of her idea to come out with a New York style rye whiskey with Christopher Williams of Copper Sea and Black Button and New York Distilling Company. There were a few sort of founding partners of the Empire Rye project. So the idea is this is a 2-year-old rye whiskey made from New York rye grain and distilled in New York. And as long as you meet all of that criteria, you can call it Empire Rye, and you get this little logo. I don't know if I can show it to you there.
The logo there, yeah.
You got it. You got it.
That actually signifies it's Empire Rye.
Exactly. So this, and initially I was sort of worried that there wouldn't be enough to distinguish this from other rye whiskeys. But if you think about how Tennessee whiskey is differentiated from bourbon whiskey, it isn't very differentiated. I mean, there's the Lincoln County process, which some distillers, Jack Daniels, really lean into. Dickel, they kind of lean away from. But it's a geographical distinction more than anything else. And I think at this point, most people acknowledge that Tennessee whiskey is essentially bourbon by another name with a little bit of a tweak to it. So this is rye whiskey that's made in New York, Empire Rye. And in our case, it's 80% New York State Danko rye. That's the varietal of rye. And then 20% English malted barley.
Excellent. Cheers. Lovely stuff. And again, wow, to make it Empire Rye, it has to be what percentage in New York? 80%, or it has to be?
It has to be 75% rye grain grown in New York State.
And at least 2 years old.
And at least 2 years old, yeah.
2 years old. And now we're seeing, in addition to yours, what about 10, 15 distilleries doing this in New York? Or? There's
probably about 10 distilleries that have an Empire Rye released, and then maybe another 15 to 20 that have a plan to make Empire Rye.
Excellent.
And this is really, I think, the forefront of a broader trend in American whiskey, which is really the regionalization of American whiskey. You look at a map of Scotland, there's all these different regions of Scotch whiskey. You know, the regions of American whiskey have been Kentucky and Tennessee. That's what it's been for 100 years. That's the regions of American whiskey. But for the last 10 years, we've seen the Northeast get a little bit into rye whiskey. We've seen Texas have sort of a barbecue, kind of smoky, barrel-heavy whiskey. Pacific Northwest is doing a lot of single malts. So, you know, really each part of the country is trying to carve its own sort of space within this broader world of American whiskey. And so Empire Rye is our New York way of kind of acknowledging our history and making a whiskey that's really authentic to our agriculture and to our distillation culture.
I like it. And again, it's Empire State Rye is just the beginning of what you see a trend in. As we think about the Scottish map, we think about the different areas of Scotland. You think we'll eventually see one of those? Obviously, we're a lot bigger than Scotland. You think we'll see one of those that'll be more well-defined? I think it'll be, I mean, just like the map of Scotland, I think it'll be a way of organizing American whiskey. Right. I don't necessarily think it's going to tell you that much about the whiskey that you're drinking, and the idea of where a wine comes from is a debated topic. You know, there's the idea that terroir, which is kind of this concept of the soil and the climate and the culture and the tradition of a region, may have some impact on what you produce. I don't know how much we're going to actually see that, but I think people are looking beyond, you know, Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. There's a lot of people that are into Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. That's a huge category, a lot of excitement around that. But I think there are people who are looking a little beyond that and kind of intrigued at what's at the fringe of what's being developed in other states, other sort of regions of the United States. So I think this is the beginning of a concept. We've seen Missouri do something kind of similar with their distillers. Texas also has kind of a certified Texas whiskey kind of process. So you're starting to see states kind of
band together and say, this is our opportunity in a marketplace. We are too small on our own, but if we get together and work with each other, we can actually make something that may be larger than each of us individually. And that's been what's so great about this project. We started, I want to say about 5 years ago, and released the rye 3 years ago. And so each year there's a little bit of a more evolved version of this, as we all have older and older whiskeys. We all started laying it down at the same time. So no Empire Rye is older than 5 years. Most of it is 2 year, and then you have some older stuff in there. We're going to come out with a 4 year later this month, a bottled in bond single barrel of rye. That's a distillery exclusive. But the hope is, as time goes on, we'll have older and older releases of our rye whiskey, just as we have had of our bourbon whiskey.
This is, and again, this is about 2 to 3 years old, what we're trying right now.
Exactly, yeah.
But plans for a 4-year-old later this month. It's going to be a bottled in bond Empire Rye.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Will this be the first bottled in bond Empire Rye then, this one you're releasing?
We did another single barrel last year. It's kind of our, sort of cap of the rye project. But, what's interesting about the bottled in bond rye, it's older, but I would argue, I hate to say this always, but it's the younger version of the rye is better. After 4 years, you get a lot of barrel coming through in our particular rye, and it's fun to celebrate a 4 year. But in fact, maybe the flavor is a little more balanced on the sort of flagship Empire Rye that we do. So
better, yeah.
The other thing I will say about this is we do have it in pretty broad distribution right now, because we just did a blend just before Christmas. So we have it. It's going to sell out. It's going to be gone for 9 months or 10 months, and then it's going to come back in the sort of holiday season again. So now is one of the few moments when you can log on to our website. We have an out-of-state portal that can get you rye whiskey to 40 states in the United States through our e-commerce retail partners. We can't, like many distilleries, we can't ship direct and anytime. We can ship within New York State to our to New York customers right now. But beyond that, we use this e-commerce portal so people can get their hands on Empire Rye. And, it's been a topic that people have been discussing. I think Empire Rye has shown very well in competitions and in reviews. So there's a lot of excitement around Empire Rye generally. So I think we do a strong entry. One thing I'll say about our entry, we do a higher proof than most of our peers. So this is a 51% rye whiskey, which
excellent.
Has a little more heft, a little more, heat on it. But this is a smaller barrel whiskey. We do now we're using all different barrel sizes, but for the rye, we tend to keep it on the smaller side, just so you get a lot of barrel emphasis. Again, it is a 2 year age statement, so you want a little bit more barrel to it than what you would get out of a 53.
And just tons of spice. I mean, you think about when we talk about rye whiskey having spice, some have more spice than others, and this one is one that's just full of these. And maybe it's because we just came out of the holidays, but I get a lot of those holiday spices. Think about, the holiday puddings, the old classic desserts, baking spices. There's just tons of just beautiful, even cardamom. There's just tons of characteristics on this. This is so unique.
And it's got a very funky sort of base to it. I feel like a lot of rye whiskeys, they kind of try to hide the rye because it is kind of a weird flavor. Certainly by no means as familiar and accessible as the corn you get out of bourbon whiskey. This is kind of a farmy, sort of funky, fermenty flavor to it that I don't get a lot in commercial ryes. So to be able to have something that's, really, and I think that's true of a lot of the New York State ryes, is they're made at a small scale. They do kind of emphasize the grain, which if really, you have a high content of rye and you're doing a pot distillation or a low rectification distillation, like many of the New York producers are doing, you get a lot of that sort of funk that comes through, and it's really nice.
Yeah, the funk is actually one of those things. It's a really tasty funk. You really can get that interaction of the barrel with the whiskey. almost as, I think about kind of this really beautiful note on a lot of really deeply aged, like bourbon barrel or whiskey barrel beers, where there's this really deep, sort of thick thing that happens, and it's something that this kind of thickness with regard to the interaction of the liquid itself with the barrel is something that I don't really taste. I mean, I tasted on other whiskeys, but on this, coupled with that spice, it's a very unique note. This is something that's very special.
Yeah.
Delicious stuff. And again, if you want to get a bottle of that, if you're in New York, they can send you some. You still have a little bit left. Otherwise, you look for it across the country. You can find it on that website.
Well, if you go to Kings County Distillery, yeah, you can find it through a retail partner. And so I would say for the next month or so, it's available, and then it will go away, and then there will be none of it for about 12 months, and I'll be fielding inquiries throughout. But it's our most coveted whiskey that we make the least of. And I think this year we're actually going to do a spring distillation of rye. Usually we do a fall distillation after the harvest, but if we can find a way to do a spring distillation, we'll do that too.
And the place to go to find that and all the ones we'll be talking about, kingscountydistillery.com. Again, I see a lot of you all just joining us on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Take this chance to share this video with your friends on social media. Retweet it. Share it on Facebook, YouTube, all those great places. And don't forget, it will be up permanently on this video channel that I hope you're subscribed to. If you're not, go ahead and subscribe to it. And make sure if you're a podcast fan, you all subscribe to our podcast. We'll have the audio of this up there. Delicious Empire Rye. Congratulations on this release. All right, what do we want to try? What do we want to try next? What do you recommend next?
Well, that's the most exciting thing we have, but I did want to sort of.
It's all exciting.
Just lead with what's good. But one thing I sent you a bottle of our latest bourbon.
Yes.
One thing that's important to kind of communicate to the world is that our age statement on the bourbon is now a 3-year age statement. We've for a long time made a 2-year bourbon. And it's just that we have enough aging inventory to push the age statement a little bit. And maybe it's a little richer, it's a little rounder. I'm very pleased with this latest bourbon that we've done. So
I had already poured myself a little here. This again, usually your bourbon in the past had a minimum of 2 on it. Now it has a minimum of 3.
Right. And I'll say this has barrels all the way up to 5 years old, and it's 6 years old. We have our warehouse is, 0 to 7 is kind of where we're at in terms of our aging profile. Obviously, if it's 7 years old, we're going to try and hold it for something special. But Ryan has a habit. He's our head blender who succeeded Nicole. He has a habit of putting very valuable old whiskey into the flagship, which as the sort of person in charge of finance and marketing, I'm sort of a little bit like, don't do that because it's so valuable in other ways. But I also don't tend to, mess with his palate. I mean, I trust his palate, and whatever he wants to do is, at this point, we've built a reputation through a lot of the whiskeys that have come out before, and it would be very silly for me to monkey with his process. So, anyway, this is a really great whiskey. This is
beautiful. This new release is so nice. And of course, I've always said from the very first time I tried your bourbons years ago, I said this tastes so much older than even its oldest barrel in it. And now it's tasting even older. It's, to me, always, Colin, had a much deeper and older flavor. And whether I'm guessing with age or I'm saying, some people say don't drink by the age statement, drink or a calendar, drink with your palate. With my palate, it just has deeper notes than other craft distilleries or any other distilleries. Other distilleries of the same characteristic. What gives your whiskey that older flavor? What do you think?
Well, 2 things. One is a very judicious, rigorous sort of barrel selection process, and using different formats of barrels. That's 15-gallon barrels, 53-gallon barrels in here. Just a wide selection of barrel formats. And then the other thing that's important for all of our whiskeys, we have a much more viscous whiskey. We don't chill filter. This is pot distilled whiskey. It just has a kind of richness to it that is definitely born of the pot stills, that gives you that sort of, velvety mouthfeel.
Oh yeah.
And I think adds, a smoothness. Well, I'll say both the pot still and the use of the pot still, by using narrow cuts off the pot still, we get just the flavors that we want, and this really sort of viscous, rich flavor profile on that very narrow cut. I think I would say that is the single thing that is a kind of a discovery as a distiller, is just avoiding a column still. That's a hot topic, but something we've always wanted to do, and really just leaning into the pot still and the funk, I guess, and
allowing those flavors from the pot still to really talk, and that's what you have always done. Question from our friend in the biz, Donald Snyder. He asks, does Kings County have a personalized barrel selects program?
Well, we do a lot of store picks. So you can find single barrels of Kings County from retailers in Connecticut, Texas, and a few other places. If you come to the distillery as a group, as a club, we can sell you a single barrel. I will say we single barrels have become that has become the demand of single barrels went from about 12 a year to, I think if we had 500, I think we could sell them. So and we have maybe 36 on a given year. So we have them. If you come as a club, that's going to maybe push you a little higher in the sequence than just a retailer. Although we do try to reward retailers, and the retailers that come back to us for multiple barrels usually get a little bit deeper into the warehouse. So, but if you do find one of those store picks, or if you want to come into the distillery, we will find something really good for you. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there is one. It's gotten more and more popular. You have found that, and thanks for the question, Donald, and anyone else who has questions on Kings County, please tweet us back, ask down below on YouTube, Facebook. You have found that during the pandemic, there have been more and more liquor stores that have said, let's do single barrel, send us the samples. You've just seen it grow like crazy.
It's been popular because you can imagine people are mostly drinking at home, and they're buying new, they're adding to their collection, and so single barrels are a great way to differentiate, And we take our single barrels very seriously. So again, Ryan, who picks them, it's usually about 12 barrels that he'll pull in a set, and he'll do it, 2 or 3 times a year. So it's not like you're getting the sort of first barrel that turns 3 years old. You're getting something that's been particularly chosen for its character. And so, yeah, I think that's certainly something we want to continue doing. We'll have more 7-year-old single barrels that are coming due this year, and those are things that'll go around to retailers to the rest of the country, not just as a distiller exclusive as it's been. The joy of being a distiller who's been at it for a while is you start to get some of this older stock that you can kind of send around to people and say, here's something really kind of special.
Excellent. Again,
not always, better, but again, better is one of those things that we tend to sort of assume that there's just a grade and everything is graded on a curve, and that number rating sort of makes sense for whiskey, but in reality, whiskey is as diverse as food, and sometimes you want pizza, and sometimes you want, the filet mignon, and sometimes there's a lot in between there. So, but I will say it's nice to finally have the filet mignon to be able to share with people, and
right, to have that older flavor, and of course, we love tasting the 7-year-old with you a few months back, and to celebrate your 10-year anniversary as New York City's oldest distillery there, and well done with that. You're saying we may see some other 7-year-old releases.
So yeah, that was the first of a waterfall of barrels. We have another one coming due in March. So, and then it's once a month. So from that point forward, we should have a 7-year in regular rotation, trying to get it around to as many places as possible, because it is the oldest whiskey, the oldest bourbon whiskey distilled outside of Kentucky, Tennessee, maybe you throw Indiana, Virginia in there, but traditional sort of bourbon country.
Right.
We do have the oldest. I can say it now because nobody's ever called me on it, credibly. So we have the oldest bourbon whiskey distilled
outside of those regions. It is, and it's and I loved that 7. Now, when you said you're going to release something once a month, is it going to be a similar release to what we had a few months back? Is it going to be a different type of release? Is it more?
Well, they're all going to be single barrels, so it'll be interesting to see whether there's a relatively consistent flavor profile or whether we see a lot of variation. Mm-hmm. And I just cannot say right now what that's going to look like, but the idea is that we have one available once a month, but whether or not we choose to bottle it, I think depends on what's the whiskey in the barrel, and should it go longer? Should it get bottled? Should it get blended down? Hopefully it's not that. But sometimes we get barrels that are just weird, and there's always sort of an audience for that too. So I think in general, if we're going to put it out there as something we really stand by as our single barrel release, it'll be a pretty high quality.
So yet to be determined. Probably this year we'll see more 7-year-old releases, and some.
For sure, you'll see more 7-year releases. The question is just, which is it going to come from? The March barrel, the April barrel, the May barrel, that kind of thing.
We'll see more of those. That'll be more single barrel. Whether they're blended, it will be probably available at your distillery, and will it be in other markets across the country, or more
in other markets across the country? Yeah. Nice. And right now we have most of the Northeast and Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee. So we're starting to get around a little bit after some time. Georgia, Wisconsin, Missouri, California. Hoping to maybe add Illinois, Colorado. That's been good states that have spurned us thus far, or just haven't discovered us. I mean, the funny thing about distilling is it has become so regional that Colorado has great craft distilleries of its own and hasn't necessarily looked abroad, so to speak, for craft. But I think now that we're a little bigger and people are kind of, again, sort of looking towards, well, we want to have a great whiskey from the Northeast. People find us that way.
Excellent. Again, for those of you just joining us, Colin Spoelman of Kings County Distillery, founder, distiller. You're watching Bourbon Blog Live, and we're going to try another whiskey with him here, but definitely continue to ask questions, a lot of great questions. And tell us down below what Kings County whiskey you've tried, and just tell us where you're watching from. And it sounds like how many total states are you in now? I know it's really grown. It's how many total? It's
about 20 states.
Okay.
Maybe 23 if you count some of the control states that order by the case, but yeah.
And I like what you were saying. I mean, I think it's so important to mention, because I think there still are so many people that, obviously, older bourbons, older whiskeys, there's a real argument for the notes they bring. But I've heard you say a couple times, sometimes with your whiskeys, you like them as
sometimes with other people's whiskeys too. I like them. But I could say that for Wild Turkey. I could say that.
What do you like about with regard to your own? What do you and again, I know it's always situational, but what do you like?
Well, I think there's a balance of grain and spice and sort of heft that really, if there was this article that was making the rounds by Lou Bryson that after the sweet spot is 7 to 12 years, and after that, it's the distillers wouldn't pick it necessarily, and I guess that is true for me as well. But I wouldn't discount those older whiskeys because they kind of help illustrate why you like the 12-year. You know, I mean, you can't say the 12-year is great if you've never had the 18-year or the 21-year. Right. So we will make whiskeys, older age statement whiskeys that are maybe a little overaged, if you want to say that, just to let people decide. I'm not the arbiter of what's good. And we
Right.
make whiskeys. We make chocolate whiskey. We make moonshine. We make a lot of stuff that people would turn up their nose at. But I like everything that we make, and it's all slightly aimed at a different type of palate. So the older whiskeys, I think it's important to have those, even if you don't necessarily select them for yourself, just to understand what you're capable of as a distiller, just to kind of round out the sort of possibility of what you can do as a distiller. So I tend to like those older whiskeys just as a more educational thing rather than something you're just going to be enthusiastic about. There's a romance to it. I like that too.
Yeah. There's certainly that romance. And what I loved last time we had John Colin, when we did try that 7-year-old, it's not to say that the 7-year is the same as or just as good as. It's good for a different occasion. But to know that your 7-year-old, to me, tasted so much older and got up into that realm of, really old 13, 15-year-old barrels, and with that beauty, but at the same time, as I reached back for your original release, still there's something beautiful there too. So to know that you can create whiskey from one house that can be so great across the board, to me, that's you've done something really right. To know that it can all we can be excited about all of it.
Right. Yeah, I'm never going to turn a whiskey down, really. I mean, we have in fact turned some whiskey down. We have some deliberately overaged whiskey. I think it's like 6 to 7 years in a 5-gallon barrel. It's not even whiskey that we would sell, but it's whiskey that I like to share with people just to sort of prove that you can overage whiskey and that there is a point at which it doesn't become, super palatable, but it's still valuable. I guess that's the difference. Is some of it is, palatable versus valuable versus coveted. That's an interesting discussion in the world of whiskey.
To know what's actually rare. I went ahead and poured. I think was the next one you want to do the wine barrel?
Exactly. Yes.
We'll do this wonderful wine barrel, and again, this is finished in Channing Daughters wine casks. And again, this is a distillery exclusive. Or if you are in New York State, you can order it in New York State, right? From
New York State, we can ship to you, but outside of New York State, sorry, this one.
Yeah, this is really beautiful. So tell us about this. This is a winery from upstate that you've been finishing this in.
Yeah, they're out on Long Island, and they're a wine that we as a New York distillery have the option to sell wine and beer from farm wineries, farm breweries in our tasting room. And so we had always been selling Channing Daughters because they make fantastic wines. And it just so happened that we had the opportunity to collaborate, buy a couple of their barrels. So this is a blend of 2 barrels. This is a Blaufränkisch and a Dornfelder. Those are the varietals. And I think if people are used to wine finished whiskeys, you're talking about port or sherry. These are fortified wines. They tend to be very sweet. They tend to be very, I don't want to disparage the entire category of sherry, but a little more one note than this particular wine, which is really sort of rich and funky and kind of has a lot of the values that we as a distillery have. Right. So to be able to merge our sort of funky, whiskeys with the funky wine, you get this great sort of unusual, nothing like this in the sort of wine finish world. Angel's Envy is a great example for people to sort of understand what a wine finish is. This is certainly more avant-garde than that.
It is so it's so unusual, and again, these are sweeter wine. These are more dessert wines that these were mentioned. Fortified wines, Blaufränkisch. Tell me the names again.
Blaufränkisch and Dornfelder. So these are not actually fortified wines that we're using for this particular wine finish, which is a little unusual. Most wine finished Scotch whiskey, for instance, is sherry or port, which are both fortified. And we have played with fortified wines ourselves, but in this case, this is just these are, red wines, sort of a little sweeter. Yeah, it's true, but not particularly fortified.
This is so nice, and you get that wine note. It's not overdone, but there is some nice fruit that comes about. Um,
Mhm.
that kind of almost whether it's like blueberry, blackberry thing. It's creamy. There's a lot going
Yeah,
on here. I mean, this is almost
there's a
kind of
lot
this
going
buttery.
on.
It's so interesting. And when if I first had it, no, somebody said um, they didn't tell me if it was a wine finish. I might after enough of it, I might know. But at first, it's just
Yeah,
this wonderful harmony of flavors. It's wonderful.
yeah, it's a little more subtle. We've done different sort of wine finished experiments in the past. Um, with Cabernet Sauvignon that was much more obviously wine finished. This is
Right.
a little bit more unusual and sort of for the wine drinker. I mean, if you are a person who is a wine geek and you're into whiskey, wanting to get into whiskey, curious about whiskey, this is kind of aimed right dead at you. And I can certainly say this is the only American whiskey finished in both Dornfelder and Blaufränkisch wine barrels on the market. So
This is the only one.
this is the only one.
This
And
is beautiful. 2 years, about 2 years old as a
so
bourbon.
it's 2 years in the bourbon. It's a 2 year bourbon that's then finished for another year in the wine barrel.
And that's a whole year in a wine barrel. That's a
Yeah.
little longer than most any other distillery I can think of that's doing something similar.
Yeah, we were used to doing that sort of very sort of stewed fruit, tomato forward kind of umami characteristic from the Cabernet Sauvignon. Kept waiting for it to come out of this, and then finally we were like, oh, you know what? This isn't what this is about. This is about sort of more subtle flavors. So again, it's in the avant-garde of wine finish. But really cool and really rich and textured. And as you say, again, it has that sort of buttery, sort of velvety, kind of rich characteristic that a lot of Kings County whiskeys have. But
Yeah.
it just also has it's cool. There's nothing like it.
It's great. A beautiful finish, and it's very it takes you to a lot of places as it goes about the process. This is a limited edition. Will we see you do a different one next year? What is
We're playing with some finishes. I won't give too much away. But it's never going to be the focus of our distillery is to
Right.
finish whiskey, because we are, I think, when you are sourcing whiskey from another distillery, that's your kind of your play is to
Right.
play with finishes and so forth. Since we are so focused on the distillate and the aging of our own whiskeys, it's never going to be a sort of dominant strategy, let's say, in terms of making whiskey, but it's certainly something that's fun to play with. And obviously this is just a really cool, weird whiskey to be able to share with people. So, and that's what we always want to be doing. If we want to be known for anything, it's great whiskeys, but also cool, weird whiskeys that are, that you've never had anything like it.
You like to have fun too, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
which is good. Frank is asking, and I think I already know, but we'll go ahead and say, can any of these be purchased at liquor stores in New York? You're all over both the city and state. I mean,
yes. New York City State, well covered. Certainly within New York City, we have about 200 stores, easy to find. New York State, reasonably easy to find, but more of your boutique kinds of stores that kind of understand craft and are going to be promoting the sort of local producers. And then about 20 to 3 other states. But the wine finish is available in New York retail. And so that is a little thing that we get to share with New York stores that we haven't yet went to distributors beyond.
Yeah, this wine finish. The more I tried, I mean, we were saying like different jams or jellies, and I'm thinking about kind of that beautiful note. And maybe it's just like yourself coming from the South. I'm thinking about a really great fresh biscuit, and with the way that butter hits it and the jam and everything, it's just to me, I'm getting that with other spices. It's very layered. It's beautiful. All these are beautiful. And again, to go back to that question of whether it's bourbon or whiskey. What makes Brooklyn bourbon and New York bourbon? Obviously, we love what you all do, but With regard to New York grains, what do the New York grains? What element about it being a New York grain really speaks to the characteristics? What is it about New York grains that does this?
I think it's hard to ascribe too much to the grain piece of it, because I feel like what defines New York, let's say you're talking about beer, you're talking about New England IPAs, you have this sort of geeky culture about trying to like push something at a very small scale to an extreme.
Right.
I feel like that's sort of where New York distilling right now is. We're not trying to replicate Kentucky bourbon. We're trying to take, a rye whiskey and say, let's increase the rye content. Let's do something pot distilled. Let's do something that's more flavor forward and push it to the extreme. So you get these kind of nerdy, geeky approaches to traditional styles, but right. But it's more cultural than it is agricultural, So I do think there are certainly some flavor differentiation between some organic corn, as somebody who has tried futile with no success to make biscuits in New York from the kind of flour that you can buy in a New York grocery store. There's certainly differences in the flour in the other grains that are grown in New York. How much of that carries through to the whiskey, I don't know. But I think, again, maybe it's more of a cultural thing where we're trying to do something different from Kentucky bourbon. We're trying to make bourbon that expands the category of Kentucky bourbon into whatever Northeastern bourbon might be, or Northeastern rye, if you don't want to drink Northeastern bourbon, which there's plenty of people who don't. We want to just create, again, that sort of weirder, more unusual, more it's just something you've never had before. And the only thing I would say is, if you love Kentucky bourbon, you've got a lot of it to pick from. A lot of it
exactly
tastes a lot of the same. So if you want to get a little bit outside the box, you gotta go pretty far. You gotta go to New York. You gotta go to Texas. You gotta go to Pacific Northwest, where you have pretty distinctive flavor profiles.
I agree. I think it's so important, and we've always enjoyed what you've done, and you continue to make more and more unique, great whiskeys. Later this month, again, a bottle and bond Empire Rye. Also later this year, we will see more of those 7-year-olds come out. Anything else that you're able to tell us about we can look forward to?
Just watch for the finishes, because we have whiskey in barrel that's going to become something else.
Okay, so finishes coming.
Yeah, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter. That's where we tell people most of what goes on. And yeah, it seems like, a pandemic year is a tough year, but after the storm comes the sunshine, and I do think once people are able to visit us again and we're able to really tell our story properly again, all of that whiskey's just been sitting in the warehouse and getting better. So good times are coming.
Good times are so much.
You heard it from me, not from anybody else.
No, they are coming, and of course, your distillery was outside of this region. One of the very last I got to visit. I usually go to so many every year, and I'm glad it was one of the very last I visited there in March before I headed back to Kentucky. Again, it's kingscountydistillery.com. That is the place to go, and you are watching bourbonblog.com/live. Make sure you follow us there everywhere you've been watching us. Colin, it's always a pleasure to have you on here. So much to look forward to. We should also say, I do think someone asked, you are sending whiskey within New York. Otherwise, you can find out where you can find it on your website. Are you doing any bottle service to go? What's it look right now like at the distillery right now?
Right. So at the distillery, you can come visit if you're willing to stand out in the cold.
Okay.
So we are doing bottled cocktails and whiskey to go pick up from the window. That's still going to go on, but mostly what we're doing right now, shipping around New York State. And if you're out of New York State, just come to our website. We will connect you through our out-of-state portal to a retailer that's legal to ship to you. So in every way, it looks like you're ordering from us, but you're just ordering from a retailer that's licensed to ship to you. ultimately is the person who's selling you the whiskey. So that's not all that different from what Caskers or Drizzly or any of the sort of tech sort of platforms are doing. So this is just one that's specific to us. So it is kind of a great time because for a long time, Kings County was not able to really get its whiskey around unless we had a distributor in a territory. So in addition to those 20 states where we have good, strong distribution, now there's another 20 states where at least we can get you a bottle. There's always going to be the Michigans of the world where you're just out of luck. But all I can say is, we're in political times. Vote for alcohol. That's an important way to think about how you're voting. So what these laws are coming down right and left, and so I think the era of direct shipping from distillers. You've seen it coming from Kentucky. That's really exciting to us as New York distillers. I've been tweeting at Andrew Cuomo pretty aggressively to say, let's not let Kentucky lead on the liberalization of alcohol laws.
Right.
New York should step up. So I'm grateful to Kentucky for leading the way in terms of hopefully breaking down some of those barriers that I hope other states will adopt soon.
Absolutely. Well, this amazing. So great to see you, my friend, and just keep up the great work there, and can't wait to get back to the gatehouses and the distillery. And these were delicious. Empire Rye. We tried the bourbon, the newest batch of the bourbon, and also this wine cask finish. This is beautiful too. Thanks everybody for watching, wherever you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel, share this video. Colin, great to see you, my friend. Cheers.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.